This
Welcome you all.
conference will now be recorded.
Today's webinar, the topic is Introduction of Transfer Pricing Regulations, and the speaker is our own CA Vyomesh Pathak, and we have a new speaker, CA Parag Giri. I welcome both the speaker on behalf of the participants. Friends, I would like to make an announcement that tomorrow we have a session by CA Shweta Ajmera on TDS provisions applicable to non-resident and the practical aspects of 15 CA CB form. So the link will be shared in the group. I request all the participants to join the tomorrow's webinar also. Now I hand over the charge to our chairman, C. Ankit Agarwal. Thank you.
Thank you, Mayur. Good evening, friends. A warm welcome to all of you on behalf of Kalyan Dombivli branch. As Mayur said, this is the 8th session on International Tax Series. This is a very proud moment for the branch, for our speaker who designed this course, Vyomesh Bhai, and all the young and dynamic speakers who have attended, who have delivered the sessions, and all the participants. Friends, it's great to see that we every day we get around 80 to 100 participants joining this course. Secondly, I also request you to please do the certification course on international tax. It will help us more effectively in gaining the knowledge of international taxation. We have tried here to cover all the concepts, but once you do the certificate of international course, international tax, you will get to learn something more and it will be a value added. Secondly, we are planning a series on standards on auditing jointly with WIRC. It will be basically for the small and medium practicing professionals, and it will be covering the audit standards. It is I know it's very unique webinar, but it will help us. So I will request all the members to please join it. It will consist of 4 webinars of 2 hours each. I wish all of you a very happy learning. With this, I hand over the charge to Vyomesh Bhai and Parag Bhai. Over to you. Thank you, sir.
Thank you, Ankit and Mayur, for the welcome address. As Ankit rightly said, we can do diploma in international tax, and if you require, we can arrange for that in our branch itself. So maybe once we are done with the all the sessions, if anybody is desiring to do the diploma in international tax, you are most welcome, and you can send in your request or suggestion. We shall be happy to conduct or arrange that in our branch in itself. We have a live example in front of us today. Diploma in international tax, all India first ranker Parag Giri is there to join me today in today's session. Parag has topped the diploma in international tax, and he is the first ranker when he appeared. Parag, when did you appear? 2018?
I appeared in the last exam itself. Yeah.
Last. Yeah. So we have the latest All India first ranker in diploma in international tax. And just to give you brief introduction about Parag. Parag is a young and dynamic chartered accountant. He has done his I think articleship from Sushil Lakhani, and he was with Transaction Square for a while in Pune in Girish Banwari's team, and currently he is on his own. He has started his own practice in Pune, and he works all across in the international tax and transfer pricing based on his experience during his stint at Transaction Square as well as at Sushil Lakhani. So today we have the pleasure of hearing Parag. You will see, though he is young, but he has already spent a lot of time around the transfer pricing and international tax regime. So this is all about Parag, and just to give you a brief about today's topic, I won't take much time from Parag, and of course I'll chip in wherever required. But the topic for today's discussion is introduction to transfer pricing regulations. Now, as you all know that we have covered the basic aspects of international tax, the treaties, etc. Now we move to the next chapter, that is transfer pricing, which is altogether a separate code in itself. We have separate transfer pricing regulations as far as the Indian income tax law is concerned. So the idea today is to give you a flavor of the transfer pricing regulations, specifically Indian transfer pricing regulations, obviously we may not be able to go deep into the entire regulation because it is altogether a separate subject, or as I said, a separate code in itself. But the attempt here is to give you a flavor of what transfer pricing regulation is, what is to be done, why is it required, etc. With that in mind, with that in background, we thought, or we have planned this particular session to give you a glimpse of the transfer pricing regulations. Now, I know few of you might be practicing in transfer pricing, issuing Form 3 CEBs, or even preparing transfer pricing study reports. Practically, I have seen many SMEs, SMPs rather, issuing transfer pricing reports. And what I observe is, my general observation is, many a times the method which is used for arriving at the arm's length transaction may not be correct all the way. So what I have observed is, many a times people just take a base of an existing transfer pricing report or TP study or 3CB, and they use the same method without knowing the facts of the case, etc. So what is important here in transfer pricing is, first of all, to understand the relationship between the AEs, that is the associated enterprise. Second, to understand the transaction first. Third, to understand the FAR, undertake the FAR analysis, that is the function, asset and risk analysis, and then come to the methods of arriving at the arm's length price. Rather than directly jumping onto the arm's length price, that is not the correct practice. So therefore, we will take you through what do you mean by associated enterprise, when transfer pricing kicks in, when does it trigger, etc., and what are the methods. So with this brief background, I now hand it over to Parag to take us through the transfer pricing regulations and the slide deck. Parag, over to you.
Thank you, sir. First of all, thank you to Mr. Secretary and Mr. Chairman for a very warm and kind introduction, including Vyomesh Bhai. And I have been one of the participants in the previous sessions, and we know how deeply that we are going in the concepts, as well as I could say this branch is one of the most active branches in this unprecedented times, as well as the expansion of knowledge that has been happening is unprecedented and unparalleled. And it's not like that it's happening in a standard way. It's very much planned, very much articulated, and all the topics have been selected in such a fashion that and in such a consecutive manner that would, if attended all, can give you a good background and a good in-depth analysis of the international tax regime. And and it is always fantastic to hear Vyomesh Bhai. Every time he gives new thoughts, and and we are under his umbrella, as I said earlier to him as well. So thank you so much, and thank you for this opportunity. I have received I can see messages, but I feel I can't I believe I can't reply those. So thank you all of the participants who have congratulated me for securing that AIR1. So we shall start with transfer pricing. And obviously, I hope all of you are safe in this unparalleled times and keeping yourself quarantined, and knowledge. You're keeping yourself in a knowledge expansion mode. Before jumping into the nitty-gritties of each of these topics, what I'd like to do is to give a brief background as to how and why do we need transfer pricing, and what all what was a thought, etc. So as you know, if you are transacting with a related party, let's say one person is transacting with his brother, it could be possible that the price is influenced, or the circumstances in which the transaction has been entered into could be different as compared to when you transacted with a third party. It could be anything. Let's say you do not take you have a grocery shop in a town, and you are delivering grocery to everyone, and then if your brother orders, you do not charge him delivery fee that you are generally charging, like 40 rupees per delivery, for example. That is one of the aspects that this take into account, because this cumulatively will erase the base of the source country. And if the prices are manipulated in such a way that the the taxes are unpaid in one country, then there has to be a specific anti avoidance which should address this situation. So first of all, we'll jump to the what is and why is it of transfer pricing. So there is a difference between price and transfer price. Transfer price. So price is a is a is a word used for amount charged by one person to another person, and generally unrelated parties. As well as transfer price is a price which is charged between two related parties. Now in our regime, obviously a related party has been given a specific meaning, but if you generally see, related party is a party where you can influence something. Whenever we'll go for related parties, we see that whether you can influence the other person's decision, then you can be considered as related parties for the purpose of anything. I mean, it could be anything. It's not just about income tax. So if you are transacting with related parties, and if there is a transfer of goods or services, then the price at which you transact is considered as transfer price. And it has been authored by many upheld by many authors, the difference between price and transfer price, and why it needs to be regulated. So CBDT has one specific page given to transfer pricing itself, and it beautifully explains the term transfer price, which says that when there is a commercial relationship between two parties such that the transaction itself could be affected, and it could mean that the transfer of goods or services could so happen that it could be transferred at much lesser value, or it could be purchased at much higher value than its fair market value, or the actual value of the service or goods. Then in such case, the price at which both the parties transact is transfer price, and the method through which you control this price is considered as transfer pricing. And they have also given an example. We'll also come to an example. We'll also try to understand this concept through an example in the next slides. So now, as you know, what is transfer price and transfer pricing, the main question is why transfer pricing. So there is always an implicit assumption, as I said, that there would be an influence by one party over the other, and generally it is assumed that it is there in case of related party transactions. As well as if you see, there are differences between two tax jurisdictions, like India. You can take India and Singapore, India and UAE, India and Netherlands. And if you see, there is always an imbalance between both the jurisdictions. So if you can try and park the profits in a jurisdiction where there is a lower tax, that could mean that overall for a group, your effective tax rate could be much lower as compared to if you go individually in that country and pay tax as arm's length. So because of this, when you say when you transfer the profits or park the profits in another country, that means that you are eroding a base in a source country. Source country are generally developing countries, and developed countries generally has a holding structure, or where the capital flows. So generally, this developing countries has this uh, SAAR implemented, such that their tax base, whatever is available, tax base is saved and not being eroded. And we all know that BEPS, the entire regime is towards that only, that saving the base where it should actually belong. And it's not only about tax which is being unpaid. If you see a lot of forex that could have been received, had the amount been transacted at arm's length, it is also being eroded. It could also impact our economy. So obviously they have come out with another concept of secondary adjustment, where you are required to have that amount being repatriated to India, and there are certain nuances as well as reading between the lines. So far as that section is concerned, they have tried to minimize that gap as well as from tax perspective as well. Had that been a profit of the Indian enterprise, the holding company could have sucked out that profit by way of dividends. So we are also losing out on dividends if Indian company is being paid less or Indian company is paying more. And there is always a finite amount of tax that you can recover. If there is a transaction of 100 rupees, you can maybe recover 30 rupees as a tax in the total amount. So in that sense, there has to be a fair division of tax between two jurisdictions, or maybe more than two jurisdictions. And that is why it is very much important to have a regulated transfer pricing, such like we have in Sabji Mandi, where they regulate the prices so that no one is overly harmed or underly, or no one can unduly influence the prices. That is all why government is pushing for a transfer pricing regime. And they've year by year they've introduced, expanded the scope, introduced new provisions, tried to tackle down it in such a way that litigation could be reduced, etc., etc. So let's take a simple example as to how transfer price can really impact a tax base, or maybe tax profits or tax payment in one country. So let's say we have India, where tax rate is 22%, and there is a UAE where tax rate is 0%. And let's say India is a holding company and UAE is a subsidiary company. Now there is a fantastic opportunity, as we all know, about hand sanitizers. So let's say Indian company is making hand sanitizers, and the considering the impact that is this coronavirus is having, Indian company is thinking that they should expand into UAE and should also set up a company there, which should specifically cater to UAE customers' requirement. And hypothetically, we can assume that the price for the hand sanitizers in UAE is, let's say, INR 1,000 rupees, and the production cost is only 100 rupees. And for doing the marketing stuff in UAE, let's say UAE entity is spending around 50 rupees per hand sanitizer packet. And the role of Indian entity is purely from the perspective of production, and UAE entity is purely from the perspective of marketing. So we have taken two scenarios where we can really compare what nuance that you can create by just shifting the price, or maybe changing the price little bit, or and how much your effective tax rate can be reduced. So in a scenario one, I am assuming that since Indian company is manufacturing entity, and it should retain a entrepreneurial margin in India, and the UAE entity should be compensated at arm's length. Let's say, for example, they retain for every sanitizer that they sell. For example, they should retain 50 rupees, and India should retain the balance profits, whichever is available after all expenses. Then let's say they transfer it to UAE entity at 900. So if they transfer it at 900, cost being 100, that means that the profits in India chargeable to tax is 800, on which if 22% tax rate is paid, that is 176 rupees that Indian company should pay in India. And now if a UAE customer, it becomes cost for the UAE entity. So if they sell it at 1,000 and incur 950 rupees respective cost, and then they'll have 50 rupees margin, and on that they are not paying any taxes. So total tax for the entire group could be seen. And if I'm a businessman, I'll see that what is the total tax that I'm paying over all jurisdiction, excluding the departmental transfer that is happening. So it's 176 rupees that they are paying. So remember, it's 17.6% effective tax rate is 17.6% of the sale price, let's say. Now if we come to a scenario where there is no transfer pricing, and you can transfer it at any value, and obviously retaining in mind that UAE company is a subsidiary company, Indian company could sell it to UAE company at 200 rupees instead of 900 and retain only marginal profits of 100 rupees, and all the entrepreneur margin could be retained by UAE entity at let's say the balance amount that stays with UAE company is 750 rupees, and really you are not paying any taxes in UAE, so your total tax is the tax that has been paid in India, that is only 22 rupees. So if you see, there is a huge jump in terms of reduction of taxes that you are paying, and meanwhile that 22 is 2.2% of sales value. So you have directly reduced your tax at least by 15% has reduced from your 17% tax rate, and that's a huge number. Because if you see, entities, if they could control the prices in their whims and fences, then India would never earn any tax. And I am taking example that 200 is charged. If they are allowed to charge at cost, they could also do it at cost. So there is a huge difference. And if I'm a businessman, I would see that my ETR is being improved and my total retainable cash is also improved. Doesn't matter where it is parked, so long as it's within my company. So this nuances, this type of nuances can be created by way of not having a specific anti-avoidance rules, and that is how we are. As you know, globally, this transfer pricing regulations have been accepted, and that is how they are planning to tackle this.
Yeah, so just to conclude on this slide, as Parag has just given the example, basically the purpose of transfer pricing is to have the respective jurisdiction the right share of the tax which it deserves. So therefore, here if you see, if there is no transfer pricing, then India would have been at loss, and at the same time the company at the group level they are paying only 22 as a tax as against the 176. So the overall loss to the exchequer is almost 150. Now this is just an example, and if you see practically you can add as many zeros as possible. So this is the main background or the purpose of having a transfer pricing. As we saw, the purpose of DTAA or double taxation avoidance agreement is to avoid double taxation. At the same time, when we have a transfer pricing regulation, the purpose is that each respective jurisdiction should have its right and the deserving share of the taxes which is required to be paid in that particular jurisdiction. Yeah, Parag.
Thank you, sir. Correct. So absolutely. And who decides what price that one country should have would come in the ensuing slides as we try and understand the theoretical concepts. So transfer pricing regulations were introduced in Finance Act 2001 from AY 2123, and and it has been explained very well. That is why I thought that should come right in the slide. The heading is measures to curb tax avoidance, and the subheading is new legislation to curb tax avoidance by abuse of transfer pricing. And finance minister has tried to explain that uh, the profits derived by each enterprise that they carry in India or outside India, that should be controlled by way of what profits that they should be earning having regard to the activities that they are undertaking in each jurisdiction. So if you are manipulating price that is charged or paid between two enterprises, and if you could so manipulate that tax is being eroded, then it's a complete no-no for any country, and that is how there should be a reasonable, fair, and adequate profits and tax in India and everywhere else that you are functioning. It should not such happen that all the activities are done in India, but India is not getting the right amount of tax. That is what they wanted to indicate. So obviously they are saying that once you have income in India, and income should be measurable in terms of what you are charging or what you are paying to your associated enterprise outside India, and that is how they introduced many provisions in the first instance itself in Finance Act 2001. So I've tried to list down the important significant legislative amendments that has been introduced in by way of finance acts, and as we grow, we understand the lacunas in the law, and we understand the some provisions are not really making any contribution, or some provision should be amended. So that is how they have tried making provisions uh, tax friendly, I would say, as we go along for foreign enterprises. Because if you see, 1991 marked a significant year for India, because doors were open, were made open for global companies to come to India and do business. Now, naturally, for that purpose, the money would come from developed countries, and that is how there would naturally be existence of a related party transaction. And in 2001, government understood that these companies are not paying taxes in India very correctly, and it should be regulated in such a way that whatever fair share of functions that has been performed by Indian entity should be paid. The taxes on that should be paid to the exchequer of India. So 2001 marked a significant year for introduction of TP regulation. 2009, as we 2001 to 2008 was a period for a significant uh, litigation period, and 2009 they understood that there should be some faster litigation process, so they constituted a DRP, which will not take in depth, but I'll give you a brief of that. It's a panel that has been formulated by the government, with three commissioner of income tax appeals, where once draft assessment order has been prepared in respect of any additions, you can go to DRP instead of going through a normal route where you'll have to go to CIT appeals and then ITAT. You can go to the DRP and get the matter sorted out in a time bound manner. 2012, they made again significant moment, and they introduced advanced pricing agreement. Because of paucity of time, will not take advanced pricing agreement again, because it's a separate chapter in itself. But I'll give again a brief introduction. Advanced pricing arrangement is an arrangement where the Indian government gives an undertaking, or maybe there is an agreement between a taxpayer in India and the Indian government, that for this particular transaction, the margin to be earned by Indian entity would be X percentage, or the price to be charged by Indian entity would be X amount, or price or the amount should be received by Indian entity is X amount, having regard to all the facts and circumstances. And the scope of the KP is also extended to specify domestic transaction in that year. We'll cover this aspect in later slide as well. 2013 again marked a significant amendment, because they introduced safe harbor rules. So if you don't want to go for APA, because it's a lengthy process, it would take minimum 18 to 36 months. So what to do if you have a simple functional profile, and if you don't want any litigations to happen? So they have come out with safe harbor rule, which says, again, we are not covering this aspect as well, but I'll again give a brief background. Safe harbor rules are rules prescribed by government, saying that if your profits or if your margin is X percentage, which is defined by us, then you will not be questioned much. You can file the form that has been designated to you, and only if you are eligible for that transaction, you can say that my margin is within this percentage, and I have complied with Indian transfer pricing regulations. And so, for example, software development has 17 or 18% margin that should be earned by Indian entity. Corporate guarantee commission, when you are receiving, has 2%, 1% margin, as depending upon the year in which you are receiving. And as I understand it, they should extend this benefits in AY 2021 as well, because the rule says that these safe harbor rules should be in effect for AY 17-18 and 2 years after that. So it has expired, and it's not in my knowledge whether they have extended this benefits, but I think they'll extend it in some time, or they'll come out with new safe harbor rules prescribing new percentages. 2014, they said APA rollback. That means that the agreement that has been entered into can be made applicable for past 4 years as well. And they also brought out with a very beautiful concept of deemed international transaction, where SAR is also further provisioned by another SAR, you can say, where if you try to avoid SAR, there is again a SAR which will catch you up. So we'll take a couple of examples for deemed international transaction in ensuing slides as well. 2015, we came out with the range concept, where if your margin is not up to right up to the comparables margin, but if it is within the range, provided you satisfy certain conditions, then your margin would be accepted, and you will not be liable for any additions. And apart from that, wherever range concept is not available, there is obviously a concept of some escalation in terms of price that you charge. They also came out with use of multiple year data in year 2015, and all these two amendments are in line with global transfer pricing regime, where it's not an exact science. So you'll have to be reasonable as to what you say about transfer pricing, because the the easier that it sounds, not it's not that easier to implement, because of the various functions, the different functions that two enterprises might be undertaking, risk that they might be undertaking or assuming, or the assets that they might be employing in respective jurisdictions. 2017 again, they came out with a secondary adjustment that we discussed about, curing the imbalance in the forex reserves, and they came out with, in line with the EPS project, they came out with section 286, which explains country by country reporting, and we'll cover that part in later slides as well. And in capitalization, where interest is restricted when you pay to, it's not really part of the, you cannot say that it's a significant part of the transfer pricing, but yes, it has some interaction with transfer pricing when the section 94B was introduced with respect to thin capitalization. So after the introduction of transfer pricing, this has been one of the most disputed regime in our history, because every now and then you will see difference of opinion between the assessing officer and the taxpayer. Taxpayer would say that I have performed this many functions, so this company should not be comparable to me. The assessing officer would say no, we'll have to accept this company, and there is a difference between the percentage of exports that you make, or the turnover that you are making, and there will be a lot of differences, and because of this difference of opinion, and strictly from a comparability perspective, there was a very big jump in terms of number of cases that that was registered in case of transfer pricing. Uh, but uh, as we go along, they've introduced safe harbor. They've uh, they've done APA rollback, APA introduction. They'll do more stuff. They've come out with DRP, and they'll come out with, as this. This has been coming in news that India will be made a global manufacturing hub, and they've also reduced tax to 15%. It might be possible that for manufacturing entity they can come out with a different set of safe harbor rules. If you are exporting, if you are making in India and exporting to other countries, where there could be some relaxation in terms of litigation that could happen to you. So it's not formally available everywhere, but they will come out with some of the other guidance. To try to list down the important provisions under Income Tax Act 1961, and we have covered some of these provisions. Some of these provisions are a separate chapter in itself, and we'll take it as we go along in this series. Um, the important provisions are 92, which sets the ground for transfer pricing; 92A, which explains the term associated enterprise; 92B for international transactions; 92BA for specified domestic transaction, and the most important is 92F, because that is a definition, and it defines various terms, and arm's length price is one of the terms that it defines. This is the global footprint of transfer pricing regulations being incorporated in various countries. As you see, 2000. So we marked early arrival in terms of introduction of transfer pricing, because only 28 countries at that point in time had introduced transfer pricing in their domestic regime, and as of now, around 100 countries have introduced transfer pricing regulations in their country in some or the other manner, and that is how that it is that is why it is also uh, to be kept in mind whenever you are transacting with whenever you are advising the whole group, that not only India that you are complying, you will have to comply with US or UK law as well. Parking profits in both the jurisdiction has to be at arm's length, and has to be having regard to the FAR analysis of both the jurisdictional companies. So there are three most, I would say, most important aspect to understand transfer pricing. First, you need to understand whether both the parties are associated enterprise. Second is that you should understand whether there is an once you become associated enterprise, whether the transaction that you are having with the associated enterprise is an international transaction, and third part is whether it's at arm's length. So we have covered this in the ensuing slides in detail, and the nuances with each of this. It could be a bit theoretical, and there are certain examples that has also been taken. And as we go along, feel free to put out some new thoughts with respect to this, because they have pretty in-depth rules for each of these terms. We'll first jump to associated enterprise, and let us try to understand whether two parties could be when two parties could be considered to be associated enterprise. So AE, as it is called in international tax regime, two parties are considered to be AE if uh, either the enterprise is directly participating in management, control, or capital of the other enterprise, or enterprise through one or more intermediaries are participating in management, control, or capital of the other enterprise, or an enterprise is a common enterprise which is participating in two of the other enterprises, whether directly or indirectly, in the management, capital, or control. And this is about 92A1. Interestingly, 92A1, below that 92A2 gives specific list of relationship which would definitely qualify for associate and enterprise. So it says for the purpose of section 92A1, and the emphasis should be supplied here because we'll deal with this aspect, this language that is being used. To enterprise shall be deemed to be associated enterprise if at any time cost is holding not less than 26% of the voting power, whether directly or indirectly. So in our previous example, Indian company, let's say Hand Sanitizer Private Limited and Hand Sanitizer UAE. So Hand Sanitizer Private Limited holding more than 26% would qualify for both the parties would be considered as associated enterprise for 92A2 purposes. If common owner is holding not less than 26% of voting power in both the enterprises. So let's say there is one associated hand sanitizer UAE 1, hand sanitizer UAE 2, and both of them has been controlled by a single entity, then this relationship could also be considered as associated enterprises. Now, not only as it say capital control or management. So capital could be by way of loan as well. Just because if you transfer your ownership to some other person and still, but you are funding that company significantly, then you could be considered as associated enterprise in the third link, where it says that if loan advanced by one enterprise is not less than 51% of book value of total asset of the other enterprise. Fourth is, in a case where you are not advancing loans as well, you are not participating in the capital as well, then also you could be considered as associated enterprise in a case where you are guaranteeing for for at least 10% of the total borrowings of the other enterprise. And generally, guarantee is taken from parent company, even from a subsidiary parent subsidiary perspective, where subsidiary company, which is newly established company, goes for a funding in that residence country, they generally take guarantee from the parent companies, and the loan is given on the strengths of parent companies' financials. So let's say you are not holding any capital, then also could you be considered as a? Yes. In a case where you are participating in management, that means that you can be appointing one or more key executive directors in the other enterprise, or it could be possible that you are appointing more than 50% of the board of directors of the other enterprise. In such case, also these two relationship would be considered as associated enterprise. And obviously, once you say once you say one person appoints in another one, the common person appointing in two enterprises would also be tested for a principle. Now, let's say you are not holding anything, you are not participating in management, and can there be de facto control in terms of the intangibles that you can supply or a process that is dependent? So that is covered by another specific clause, which is that if manufacturing process is wholly dependent upon IP owned by another enterprise. So let's say I am an captive manufacturer of fries for the purpose of McDonald's, or maybe captive manufacturer of bottling business of let's say Coca-Cola. So if they have supplied me defined terms of let's say that this should be added, that should be added, and the ingredients have been defined, and all this has been through a registered trademark, everything. So I am fully dependent upon the processing or manufacturing or the IPs that has been provided by Coca-Cola US, for example. Then in such case, even if they are not participating in my capital control, capital or management, I could be considered as controlled by that enterprise, and hence I would be considered as A for that purpose. Also, if you are sourcing 90% other enterprises, then you could be considered as A's. Now, that should, whether this should be considered as product wise, amount wise, or quantity wise is still not defined. But generally, whatever practical experience that I've seen is that out of abundant caution, once you cross any of this, they consider the relationship as A's, owing to the penalties that they've introduced. Now, let's say you don't have all these conditions, but you do supply certain products on someone's direction. Let's say I'm an agent of delivering Rolls Royce, for example. So and they told me that whatever you manufacture has to be supplied to some defined persons, and price and each and every delivery terms are defined by them. I'm just a trustee company here. So in such case as well, even if you are not participating in capital control, capital management, you could be controlled by another enterprise through this, and you would be considered as A. This is all about generally in case of companies. Now, when individuals enterprise along with their relatives are controlling two different AEs, two different enterprises, then those two enterprises can also be considered as A's. If one enterprise is held by HUF and the another enterprise is held by member of the HUF or relative of the member of the HUF, then these two are also considered within the AE principle. And in case of AOP, BOI or a partnership firm, if one enterprise is holding at least 10% in another enterprise, then this should also be tested for A and could be considered as associated enterprise. So now they have given enough, it could be considered as, they've given kind of an exhaustive list. Although it's not an exhaustive list, there could be n number of situations where uh, you you would be having management at one enterprise and capital in one other another enterprise, which is not covered here. So could you be considered as having an associated enterprise? And how do you read 92A1 and 92A2? So I'll go back to 92A1, which says, which simply defines, it basically gives out a layout that how one person could be considered to be having an A relationship with another enterprise. So it says that if you are participating directly or indirectly, or common person is participating into enterprise, then you are A. Now, in this 92A2 deals with specific list of transactions. So the question is whether 92A1 and 92A2 has to be read together, or once you fall in 92A1, you are not required to go to 92A2, or is it mandatory that you will have to fall under 92A2 for qualifying yourself as associated enterprise? So in a sense that whether 92A2 is near an extension of A1, or is it further supplemented by way of fact that there has to be a specific relationship which is given in A2 that you have to satisfy for becoming A. And this has been a classic debate. That, let's say, for example, having a management participation in one enterprise, and that same person is also having a equity participation in another enterprise. Let's say I am a director in UAE company, and I am holding 100% of capital of an Indian company. Now, whether these two, if you read 92A1, you could be considered as A, but 92A2 does not cover specifically this transaction. So whether you could be considered as A, because there is a common control through one at through directorship, and at another enterprise through capital. So Finance Act 2002 specifically say that if there is a mere fact of participation by one enterprise in another enterprise by way of management capital or control, does not make it A unless any of the criteria as specified in 92A2 are satisfied. That means that 92A2 further provisions A1 by way of stipulation that if you, whether or not you fall in A1, you'll have to specifically fall in A2. Even in case of stability circular in 2008, they've said in one line, a passing remark, that for becoming in A, any of the criteria specified in 2 has to be fulfilled, and then only you will be considered as A. Interestingly, and now this has been point of debate, and there is a Gujarat High Court judgment to this effect as well. But very recently, in case of Kaibi Private Limited, they have pronounced a ruling wherein they have said that A2 further provisions A1. If you have to be associated enterprise, you have to first fall in the specific limbs, any of the specific limbs of A2, and then only you could be considered as associated enterprise. Now, in this case, Kaibi Private Limited, sorry, in their previous assessments, and ITET had held that both the parties were associated enterprise because of 92A1, despite the fact they were not falling within any of the limbs of A2. They have, in the recent judgment, said that we are correcting our mistake in terms of whatever that we had understood in our previous assessments, and we are upholding that A2 would, you will have to satisfy any of the limbs of A2 for satisfying A1. So once you
So here, one important aspect of 92A1 and 92A2 is that what is relevant is that associated enterprise either can be a direct associated enterprise under 92A1, or it can be an indirect associated enterprise, that is the indirect definition of AE. So therefore, or a deemed AE as the case may be. So 92A1 and 92A2 both are relevant in terms of determining whether the entity is considered to be a AE or a non-AE. See, because why this definition is relevant is unless you have a transactions between AEs, that is associated enterprise, the transfer pricing does not trigger. So therefore, it is very, very important to understand the definition. And again, both the clauses are important, 1 as well as 2. That is, the deemed AE concept is equally important because that gives more specific transaction, etc., or the relationship between the parties to define the term AE. So once you have the AE, the second leg is international transaction, and then you come to the arm's length price. So now, having understood the concept of AE, now we move towards the second part or the second concept, that is, what do you mean by international transaction? Yeah, Parag.
Yeah, thank you. So once you have established that you are AE, whether all the transactions should be tested for the arm's length principle, only if those are international transactions. 92B specifically defines international transaction, and it says that international transaction means a transaction between two or more A's. That is, determined in 92A. Either or both of them are non-resident. We'll come to this part. Both of them could be non-resident, and still transfer pricing provisions could be applied if it is in the nature of purchase, sale, or lease of tangible or intangible property, provision of service, or lending or borrowing of money, or any other transaction which has a bearing on profits, income, losses, or assets of such enterprise, and will also include if there is an apportionment or contribution to any cost sharing arrangement for developing any IP, or maybe common cost center, then also this could be considered as one of the international transaction that has to be tested for arm's length principle. So as Vyomesh Bhai rightly mentioned that it is it is it is very much inevitable to have yourself tested for international transaction for determining whether or not you should apply for arm's length principle, and consequent reportings and FARs that you should maintain. Now 92B1 is very simple in terms of the transaction that it lists, but 92B, there is an explanation to 92B which expands the scope of 92B1 very much significantly, and there are blocks in which it has been defined. So first they say tangible property, so any transaction with whether it's purchase, sale, transfer, lease, and any type of intangible properties, sure, would be any transaction in relation to these kind of tangible properties would be considered. Similarly, in case of intangible property, if you have purchase, sale, transfer, lease, then these are also considered as international transactions. And capital financing, one of the most important one, because there are certain terms that has been given. If you have a long-term or short-term borrowing, which is understandable. If there is a guarantee, that means that guaranteed transaction are also covered and has to be tested for the purpose of arm's length principle. If there is any purchase or sale of marketable securities, or any type of advance payment or deferred payment, or receivable. Receivable is also important. They are saying that if you have a receivable due for over a period, that should also be tested for arm's length principle because it amounts to an international transaction. And if after this they have said provision of service, any provision of service could be considered within the meaning of international transaction. They have listed down obviously certain specific provisions, but any service that you provide would also be considered. Business restructuring, this is also very important. Business restructuring means sale of shares, mergers or acquisitions, or any type of reorganization in terms of, let's say, for example, conversion of a toll manufacturer into a distributor, or a limited risk distributor to a full risk distributor, or any type of change in the FAR profile may also require an arm's length compensation to the A that you are transacting with. Now, so international transaction is really wide enough to cover everything, and obviously if you want to go out of transfer pricing, what you need to do is, even if you are having an international transaction, you will have to really break a relationship between two enterprises. So if you are having relationship in such a manner which has been given in 9282 or maybe in general 92F1, then any transaction that you will do generally would be considered as to be tested for the purpose of arm's length principle. Now once you break that relationship, could you circumvent the transfer pricing provisions? May or may not be. They've come out with a deemed international transaction concept, which says that when a transaction is entered into by an enterprise with a person other than an A, that means an unrelated party, it would be deemed that it has been entered into between two associated enterprise, and it would be considered as being an international transaction if there is a prior agreement between the third party and the A, or the price or the other conditions have been influenced by such A, and that other person is just acting in a fiduciary capacity. That means he does not have, for example, any role of his own. It's all managed in if you lift the corporate will, you can see that it has all been managed by A only. There has been an interposing of an entity so that you could control the price and you can really get out of the clutches of transfer pricing provision. And it is very debatable as to whether you would have a prior agreement. Can you be considered to be having influenced the terms of any of the transaction? And we have tried to cover certain examples so that we can understand what exactly they want to cover in the international transaction. So in the left part of the slide, if you are having a relationship, an enterprise is having a relationship with an AE, and you are supplying hand sanitizer, the same example where India is supplying to a UAE entity, and that is covered within the and it has to be tested for arm's length principle. Now, how can you circumvent transfer pricing? As I said, you will have to break the relationship. Now, let's say you are still holding 100% in associated enterprise. Now, instead of you transferring it to associated enterprise, you have interposed an entity, a third party, where you transfer supply, where you supply hand sanitizer, and that person just supply it back to associated enterprise. It's just mere routing of the transaction. It might also be possible as just a bill to ship to model where A is directly ordering from third party and third party is placing the order to enterprise. So if you lift the corporate will, you will see that there is a clear relationship of direct supply from enterprise to associated enterprise. So whether in this case TP should be applicable and which transaction should be tested for TP. And it says that it would be considered as the third party and associated enterprise and deemed international transaction. So transaction between A and third party needs to be tested only if to satisfy either of the condition. The first condition being there has to be a prior agreement. Let's say the enterprise has entered into a prior agreement to third party saying that you control price, you control the delivery function, whatever that you want to do, but there is a prior agreement that you will have to purchase it from me only and you cannot source it from anywhere else. That could be a prior agreement. Prior agreement could be in relation to timing of sourcing, or it could be anything. Or if there is no prior agreement, but third party has been retaining little over 1% or 2% margin, or maybe not retaining at all, and the price at which ultimately is being sold to A is the same price had it been sold by enterprise itself. In such case, it could be considered that you have just routed the transaction to third party, and this entire wheel has to be lifted and is to be seen as if the transaction has happened between enterprise and A. Now, in illustration 2, let's say enterprise is in India and I have appointed a shipping agent. Let's say shipping agent who does all shipping for me, and I told him that you incorporate a new entity and I'll supply my product, let's say hand sanitizers again, and that shipping agent would in turn, there would be clear change of title of ownership between enterprise and third party, and that third party would again, let's say it routes the hand sanitizers to AE back. In such case, now whether now this is surely a deemed international transaction, uh, because if we assume that there is an influence of price, and we assume that there is a prior agreement, either of the case. So now whether the since both the parties are in India, whether there could be considered as having an international transaction, because the basic concept is to tackle a transaction between one known resident and one resident, or could be two non-resident. Now, in this case, whether this could be considered as a deemed international transaction. So I'll go back to this, where in the last point where it says that where the enterprise or A or both of them are non-resident, irrespective of whether or not the other person is non-resident or not. So in fact, Finance Act 2015 clarified this position. It could be very well considered and tested for arm's length principle, even if both of them are considered to be resident in India. Now, this is really an interesting example. Let's say you have an entity in Luxembourg, and Luxembourg has reached out to laptop seller in Luxembourg that I need 40 laptops, 20 laptops at Luxembourg, 20 at India. Now, as we know, Luxembourg is a tax haven, and let's say they don't levy any taxes. India levies taxes. So how can you reduce tax? Just by increasing the price, increasing the cost in the enterprise in India. So if, for example, the terms are dictated in such a manner that A has specifically said to laptop seller in Luxembourg that you supply 20 laptops to me at INR 10,000, and you supply 20 laptops to enterprise in India at INR 50,000. And let's say the price which is ultimately that amount by laptop seller is 30,000. That he has said that I want 30,000. I don't know which entity should be billed at what amount. I need 30,000 per laptop. Can this also transaction be considered as deemed international transaction? It should be. And even if there are four entities involved, the supply of laptops, 20 laptops to Indian enterprise would be considered as deemed international transaction and has to be tested for arm's length principle, taking into account a comparable price that is available at Luxembourg, and obviously making adjustment having regard to the cost, the delivery function, and other function and difference between comparability. And if you reduce that imbalance, completely eliminate that imbalance, the difference between the price that has been charged to Indian enterprise vis-a-vis the price that has come after adjustment should be considered for international transaction. As we are in the motion, we'll also cover specified domestic transactions. This was really significant when they were having this for the purpose of 48.2b as well, and now the scope has been curtailed down, and it's applicable in a very specified circumstances. In fact, Supreme Court has recommended that why only international transactions should be tested for transfer pricing. There has to be some testing being done for specified domestic transaction as well, where you can really, when there is a imbalance of tax rate between two enterprises. So they have come out with this concept for specifically for domestic transaction, where first four bullets deals with the transactions where one entity is claiming Section 80 related deductions, or if you are having a 10AA SEZ related deduction or any other deduction which gives you deduction from your profits in respect of profits that you earn. So what you can do is that shift the profits where you are earning where you are paying tax virtually zero, and keep a low margin in a company where you are paying some taxes. So in such case, if you are covered in this one of the limbs, then you would be considered to be and you would be required to test yourself for the arm's length principle. Now, the last bullet point is with respect to any transaction business conducted in relation to relationships specified in 115 BAB. As you all know, there was taxation amendment law which was passed, which provided relief for new businesses, new manufacturing entities that has been set up, and they were allowed to take a 15% tax rate provided they certify as they comply with certain conditions. There, they have specifically caught nuances where they are saying that if you are having a transaction between two close related persons, may or may not be an A. If there is a transaction between two close persons, and if you are trying to shift profits from one enterprise, that is the high tax paying enterprise, to another enterprise, that could be that would be the person, the company which is claiming 115 BAB, can that should also be tested for SDT, and has to be done as if it's has to be done at arm's length. Now, an important food for thought for our discussion could be director, a resident in India, not drawing any salary from company. Company is opting for 115 BAB. They have a close group. They are a close relatives, close group of persons, and the director, let's say, is falling under 30% tax rate, and he is not charging any director remuneration from that company. Would this be considered as violation, and hence be tested for arm's length principle? And how will you determine what remuneration that has to be paid to that person? Should you take a guidance from section 197 of Companies Act, where it is given for public limited companies, or should you go out and venture out for related startups or maybe similar companies, where how much these directors are making? The fundamental question is that whether they should be tested for arm's length principle. Well, my view has been that it should be considered if there is a clear, uh, if you lay, the wheel has been uplifted and you can see that there has been clear violation as to, and there is the main intention of not charging director remuneration is to park more and more profits. Obviously, to be further provision by commercial reasoning, sometimes director do not suck out profits because of the reason that they want to expand more, they want to give the companies a new high. But it is recommended that not charging, instead of not charging any remuneration, there has to be some basic remuneration that should be given. It could be a median of employee salary that should be taken out by director, just to avoid hardship for a genuine business transactions. So this is all for international transaction and associated enterprise. We'll go to arm's length principle and why is it needed. So arm's length principle is defined, arm's length price has been defined in 92F. Now, let's keep in mind that when will you need to, when are you required to test yourself for arm's length price? The dissection has been given when you have an income which is chargeable tax in India. Second is that income is in relation to international transaction. Then such income being international transaction should definitely be tested for arm's length principle. And international transaction views in itself a transaction entered into between two A's, and that is why 92 does not specifically refers to 92A. And income has been defined in 224, and it's also wide enough to cover all the transactions. We have a landmark decision in case of Mumbai High Court in Vodafone, where they've upheld a principle that if you are not having an income and if it's a capital receipt which is not chargeable tax in India, then you cannot apply the nitty-gritties of 92 and transfer pricing in relation to that. But out of abundant caution, you may report those transactions for arm's length principle. Now, international transaction, as we have all understood, it is defined in 92B, and it's wide enough to cover all transactions, including deemed international transaction, and it should be tested having regard to arm's length, which is 92F. Now, 92F, it says that arm's length price means a price which is applied or proposed to be applied in a transaction. Transaction is defined between persons other than two associated enterprise in an uncontrolled condition. If that means they are saying that if you are delivering goods to your brother without delivery fee, and if you are making deliveries to others who are not related to you with delivery fee, then there is an imbalance. An arm's length principle in a transaction between you and your brother should be at the price at which you are charging it to unrelated parties, that is with delivery fee. So arm's length principle, if you read it, it's very simple. They are saying that whatever price that you charge to unrelated party, that's it. That is considered as the price that you should have charged to your associated enterprise. Now, why is it significant to have arm's length principle? Now, let's say, for example, we have a domestic enterprise which deals with end customers in India. They don't have any transaction with any other parties, and if you see, there is always an imparity between MNCs and Indian parties. And in such case, what they are trying to say is that if you have arm's length principle being built in your domestic taxation system, the imperative that is existing between the price that has been charged by MNC through their enterprise in India and the independent enterprise in India could be less and could be mitigated. Arm's length principle really determines the real taxable profit that has been earned by one enterprise having regard to the far function, assets, and risks that they have performed in India. It also reduces artificial price distortion. Now, this is really interesting. See, software-related companies, we have seen that some of the companies were earning only 5% margin in India on all costs that they were incurring. That has given a view to other global MNCs that doing business in India, obviously labor cost is low, but doing business in India is comparatively much lower than if you do that similar thing, let's say software development in US, because their development charges, let's say, $100,000 a year salary. Here, they can get labor at, let's say, $10,000 something. So they are saying that, let's say, $10,000 plus 5% margin, that is 500. So let's say if I keep that amount with India, then also I'm in a much better position is on a group level as compared to if I do it in India, in my home country, that is US. Now, this could create a really artificial price distortion if all of them are keeping only 5% margin in India. So what they are trying to say is that if you are doing a technical function in India, then in such case you are compulsorily required to be tested for arm's length, and hence this could really reduce the artificial price distortion. So now they are trying to say that 15 to 18% is a general acceptable margin for software developers, provided you are XXYY kind of software developers. And if you are a distributor, you can keep XXYY, let's say 575, 12% of margin. You are doing a marketing job, you should keep 12 to 15% margin. If you are doing just low back-end support services, you should keep 5%. So it is really reducing the price distortion that could have happened had all these MNCs been allowed to influence the prices at which they should be remunerating India. It obviously minimizes double non-taxation. As I said in our previous example, if hand sanitizer are sold to UAE entity at a price much lower than the price at which it could have been charged to another independent enterprise, then India would lose its tax base. Let's say India does not take any profits and entrepreneurial margin is shifted in Dubai. That means you are not paying any taxes in any of the country. That would leave, forget DTAA. We don't want DTAA benefits. Then also you can come out with a structure where you are not paying any taxes. That is why arm's length principle is very much needed. And it is also needed where for measuring the economic contribution that you are making to the country. All these software companies that is coming to India, if they have not been fair in terms of the price that they should remunerate the Indian entity, then we will never be able to find out in our reports as to what economic contribution that they are making in India. So if the price are charged at the arm's length, then this also could be this imbalance in the economic contribution could also be wiped out, and you can really identify each segment or each industry the economic contribution that they are making. The arm's length principle. Sorry. So arm's length principle has also been the concept has also been drawn in TP models, model conventions, and almost all DTAA provides for it. It says that first 9.1 Article 9, which deals with this, OECD and UN model are somewhat similar to for primary adjustment. It says that if an enterprise is directly or indirectly controlling the other enterprise through management, control, or capital, or the same persons, are controlling two enterprises, then and the conditions are imposed in between two enterprises such that had the transaction been done at arm's length, this could have been possible that the profits that would have been earned by one enterprise would have been much higher as compared to the other condition. So 9.1 talks about our classic 92A and 92, 92 and 92B. Article 9.2, which talks about corresponding adjustments, and it enables corresponding adjustment. It says that that once you say that you have paid another enterprise much lower than what you should have, then that the enterprise in the other jurisdiction should also get that right to uh, perfect the imbalance that you have in your in the payment that they've made. 9.2 is a corresponding adjustment similar to our secondary adjustment, not the exact one, but similar to corresponding adjustment. It could be enabled by a mutual agreement procedure where both the contracting parties consult each other as to how the arm's length price that has been determined in one enterprise could be applied in the another enterprise. And 9.3, which exists only in UN Model Convention, says that in case there is a fraud, then you will not get benefit of 9.2. If there is a fraud or mispresence or any undue advantage that you have taken, whether judicial, administrative, or legal, then you will not be allowed to have that corresponding adjustment. Now, what is the difference between our arm's length principle and model convention? So first and foremost is the triggering point. UN model and OECD model convention says that not each and every transaction has to be tested for arm's length principle, but if you know that there are conditions imposed between two enterprises which affects their commercial financial transaction, then only on those cases you need to test yourself for ALP. Now, in case of Income Tax Act, which says that all the transactions, if it is international transaction, it has to be tested for arm's length principle. A definition in UN or OECD model convention is quite restrictive as compared to income tax, where income tax is quite huge and it also covers a deemed international transaction within itself, where in OECD or UN model it is not covered. Secondary adjustment or corresponding adjustment, it is enabled by Article 9.2 in model conventions, but secondary adjustment is introduced recently in 92C in Indian transfer pricing regulations, strictly from India perspective, and only from enabling payment of further taxes in India, and it does not cure the imbalance between the Indian enterprise and the foreign enterprise. Residency, it cannot be applied in case of OECD or UN model. It cannot be applied if both the parties are non-resident. Now, this important point comes up. In India, even if both the parties who are transacting are non-resident, then also it could be considered to be tested for arm's length principle in case where the subject matter is of an Indian asset. So let's take an hypothetical example where the shares of an Indian company are transferred between two associated enterprises outside India. In such case, even if the transaction has happened between two non-residents, but since it amounts to is with respect to an asset in India, it would be considered and would tested for arm's length principle in India. So now we know once you are A's and you have international transaction, you should test yourself for arm's length principle. And how do you test yourself? What are the methods to test yourself? So before that, we'll try to understand a concept of function asset and risk analysis. Any method you would require this analysis of the two enterprises. You'll have to by written questionnaires or interviews of management at both the enterprise. You'll have to understand as a tax practitioner what all functions that Indian company is doing, what all functions that the foreign company is doing, what all risks that Indian company is assuming, what all risks that the foreign company is assuming, and the assets employed by each of these enterprises. So let's say an example. I am a limited risk distributor in India. That means that my risk is minimum. My functions are only what I'll do, what all has been given to me by my A or my parent company, and assets ideally would be minimal. In such case, the Indian party should be remunerated, which would be around like 5 to 7.5%, 7.5% to 10%. In a case where you are doing complex functions, where your functions are as compared to your A outside India, your functions are much complex, and you should be remunerated in a manner that would redeem your functions that has been undertaken in India. That's all of this. Okay, your all risks lie with India. As we all know, higher the risk, higher the return. If your risks are higher, then returns that should be remunerated to Indian party, or if the Indian party is making a payment to a non-resident, then according to the risk, this payment should be adjusted. Now I've tried to explain all the methods. There are 6 methods in total. 3 are traditional methods, 2 are transactional methods, and the 6th one is the other method, where if you don't fall in any of this, and really you don't have an option to jump around between 2 methods. It has to be scientifically seen as to which method is applicable to you according to the transaction that you undertake, according to the comparability that you have, and we'll see all the factors that you need to see to determine the most appropriate method. Now, first and foremost, and very simple one, is a comparable uncontrolled price method, where it's the most direct method, and instead of the margins that you earn, the direct price is compared. So let's go back to our previous example where hand sanitizer are transferred from Indian entity to a UAE entity. Now, in this case, if the Indian entity is having a similar transaction with unrelated party in UAE itself at the price of, let's say, 800, then that price would be considered as arm's length price, obviously to be further supplemented by the fact of quantity, the other terms of the contract, and let's assume that all of these are same, then they can't transfer it at any amount less than 800. Or let's say an example where UAE company is independently procuring from another Indian enterprise at a price, let's say 700 rupees. So what the minimum they should be paying to Indian entity is 700. They can't pay less than 700 to Indian entity for the purchase of hand sanitizer. So in this case, it needs to be kept in mind that there has to be strict comparability in terms of products and contractual terms. Let's say in our previous example where the UAE entity has sourced from another Indian supplier, the same hand sanitizers, but he has sourced only 10 units of that. And from enterprise, for an Indian entity, they've sourced, let's say, 1,000. Both of them are not comparable unless you cure this imbalance by way of an adjustment, accurate adjustment that has been scientifically been derived. Then only both the prices would be comparable. So this method compulsorily require a strict comparability in terms of products. Let's say at one place you are selling hand sanitizer, another place you are selling soap. The end result could be same to get out of corona, for example, but then uh, there is no comparability between the products, so one price cannot be imputed or cannot be taken as a benchmark for the other transaction. There are two types of cups that are available: internal cup and external cup. Internal cup is more preferable, and litigations as well, assessing officer feel much relaxed if you give them internal cup as compared to external cup, because finding an external cup is also a big task. Second method is resale price method. This method is specifically applicable where you are a distributor and you are sourcing, that is purchasing from A and selling it to an unrelated party. So again, classic example of hand sanitizer: Indian entity selling it to UAE entity selling it to unrelated party. So now if you want to see UAE entity, if you are testing transfer pricing of UAE entity, then RPM you can apply, provided you are purchasing from A, that is there, you are selling it to a known A, that is there, and both purchase and you are not making significant value addition in terms of changing the nature of the product or the characteristics of the product. That is also you are not doing. Then UAE entity can opt for RPM. Now Indian rules have been crafted and been written in such a manner that unless you satisfy all these three conditions, you cannot take RPM as a most appropriate method. So in a case where you are sourcing from, let's say, no from unrelated parties but selling it to A, you can't do that. If you are sourcing and selling, both of these is happening to an to associate enterprise, then also you can't come under this section. Or when you are doing some processes in that, let's say you are redesigning the product in itself and changing the characteristics, then you are not a mere distributor, you are also a processor. In such case, you can't take RPM as a most appropriate method. Essentially, RPM compares gross margin that has been earned, because it assumes that you are a distributor, so it does not really matter what all indirect costs that you are making, so long as your gross margin, let's say hand sanitizer gross margin to be earned by UAE entity, if you are a distributor, is, let's say, 20%. So anything more than 20% that UAE entity earns, Indian entity is losing. That means the price at which it should be sold to UAE entity has to be within that 20% reaching 20% price. Cost plus method is again, as I said, each method has its own applicability, and it cannot be, you don't have an option to jump from one method to another. Cost plus method is specifically for transfer of semi-finished goods between associated enterprise, or in case of contract manufacturing. In this case, the benchmarking is done with respect to markup that you earn and the indirect cost that you incur. So let's reverse the situation. UAE entity is having an Indian enterprise as uh, uh, a manufacturing entity, and as we all know that India would become manufacturing hub, and government is trying to put in policies, coming out with structures and relaxing FDI regulations for manufacturing, making India a manufacturing hub. So let's say UAE entity holding Indian entity, UAE entity wishes that it sells hand sanitizer. So they say that, boss, you make they say to entity, boss, you make uh, uh, hand sanitizers for us. Now they started making hand sanitizers. That means there is a contract manufacturing. Or they have done, they've they formulated a process, and then they are transferring the liquid in it to associated enterprise. In this case, you can take the CPM as the most appropriate method. The margin or the markup that has been earned by an Indian enterprise has to be compared with the similar enterprises doing similar job. And there may not be strict physical similarity between the products, but functions, largely functions, that is manufacturing, and uh, the type of manufacturing that you are doing should be similar in terms of benchmarking that you are doing. So profit split method is a unique method, and not really been practically used in many cases, where there is an addition of unique intangibles between more than two enterprises. It's so interlinked that you cannot separately evaluate one transaction and then apply arm's length price. You cannot significantly identify contribution of each enterprises independently. Then the profit split method is used, where the group profit is determined and split between each of the enterprise having regard to the uh, FAR that they have undertaken. So generally, the group profit may say, first of all, they distribute the normal profits that each enterprise should have earned. After normal profits, residual profit that remains with the entity is again distributed between all enterprises having regard to the risks undertaken, functions performed, or unique intangibles that they've made additions to. For example, there is a unique product, let's say like a mobile phone that they are building. One is putting in chips, one is putting some software, one is putting some user interface. So if you can't determine which enterprise has made what value additions, and or similar comparability is not available with respect to the same product or same processes, then you go for profit split method, where you determine group profit as a whole and then distribute in the manner provided in the rules. TNMM, most widely used method out of all methods, and generally when all of this method doesn't work because of some or the other conditions, and generally comparability issue is there, then one resorts to transactional net margin method, where a PLI, that is profit level indicator, is identified. Let's say my business is such that my profits are subject to the sales that I make, or my profits are a percentage of the cost that I incur. So that is a PLI that you have created. Once you determine a PLI, you'll have to venture out for finding the similar companies who are doing the similar functions. There may or may not be strict comparability of the products. Let's say you are in a domain of software development. You can further drill down for ERP developers, and then you can stop yourself from there, and then you can just compare the functions that you are undertaking, the risk that you're assuming, and assets for a benchmarking purpose. So the TNMM is the most widely used. Again, TNMM has internal and external TNMM, and it all depends upon. And as I said, it's not an exact science, and smartly one can play with the numbers, where you if you are an asset light model, or if you are having a heavy asset model, you link your profits with assets, and then you could be comparable or maybe within arm's length. But if you compare it with sales or maybe cost, you may not be at arm's length. So it's economics. You can derive with your own PLI, provided that your profits are linked to that asset or income, or whatever the determination that you are taking. 10AB says that if you are not falling within any of this method, you can take other method, and other method is also used many a times because there are unique transactions for which you might not be having comparable data, for which you will have to rely on expert analysis, expert reports, valuation reports, quotations, etc. So in this case, they say that if the rule 10AB could be applied, and it could be considered as an arm's length price through other method if price charged or paid or would have charged or been paid between two known AE. It takes into account all relevant facts and similar circumstances. In effect, they are saying that had the transaction been done in a manner which is between known AE, and in the similar circumstances, if you can identify that price, that price you can apply in other method. Generally, we have seen other methods in case of share transfers and in case where you are doing you are transferring precious metals or something. Also, whether quotations are included, it could be considering the language that has been used in Rule 10 AB, which is that would have been charged or paid. But if you again, it boils down to the same principle: most appropriate method. Other method is not a residuary method. Only if you do not fall in any of this method, you can go for other method. And also, other method has to be tested for the rules and the integrities. You can't directly jump to other method by taking quotations unless you don't have exact proximity or exact characteristics as to be applied for different methods. Now, what are the factors that should be taken into account for most appropriate method? There are different method, and it has been provided in the rule itself. It says that nature and class of international transactions, the classes of A that you transact with, depending upon whether the class of A is of distributor or a limited risk distributor or toll manufacturer, or availability of data. Let's say you don't have a exact comparable data available with respect to your product, then you might shift from cup to, let's say, TNMM. Degree of comparability you have of the product which is similar to you, but accurate exact will vary. In all such circumstances, your most appropriate method would vary. It is always debatable, and it has been debated in courts as well, which method is the most appropriate method, because each method could give different results, because each method determines different types of and tests different types of margins or price for its determining arm's length price.
Esse já tá uma minuto. Esse ave?
So now we have covered almost all basic topics of the and all these are theoretical topics, as we know. Practically, what all forms that you need to file, what all due dates that you'll have to either to try to list it down. So there are 3 files that you'll have to maintain: local file, master file, and CBCR. And this 3-tier approach has been given by BEPS as well, and we have also incorporated in our domestic law itself. Local file is essentially your transfer pricing file, transfer pricing study report that you make, where you do industry, where you give industry analysis, where you give relationship, where you give types of international transactions, method used, the way in which you are determining arm's length principle, the adjustments that you are making, etc. So form 3C-EB is a very simple form where you'll have to give certain particulars, and you'll have to determine there and there only whether it's within arm's length, and if not, then what accurate adjustments that you are making in your transfer pricing report. And in your total income correspondingly. 3CB has to be filed once you have an international transaction or specified domestic transaction. Now coming to master file is applicable for 2 types of entities. If you are having 2 entities in India, when you are part of a global MNC, where there first is that you'll have to appoint someone to be a constituent entity, and that you'll have to inform income tax authority 1 month prior to filing of 3CEAA, that is master file, that who will report this our master file. That has after that has been given, 3CEAA has been divided in 2 parts, and it has to be filed on 30th November. It is divided in 2 parts. Part A has to be filled by all SSC, has to be given by all SSC. Part B is to be applied and given only if group turnover, international group turnover exceeds 500 crores, and one of the conditions are met. Either your international transaction value is more than 50 crores, or transaction in relation to intangible property is more than 10 crores. Once you have satisfied all any of these conditions, then you have to file master file in India, and there will be obviously a exchange of information between Indian jurisdiction and foreign jurisdiction. And really, talking about master file, what master file seeks to identify from yourself is the far of the different enterprises, the top 5 products, the top 10 revenue making, top 10% revenue giving A's, what is your supply chain, what is your global delivery function, etc., etc. It's more on a factual basis, and defining the relationship, and they have, and that is how they'll come to know what is the imbalance that you are creating, and are you really shifting any profits outside India. And coming to CBCR, which is country by country reporting, where obviously that also is between divided in 2 parts. First is that you'll have to appoint someone as a alternate reporting entity, as a constituent entity in India, who should file CBCR. And once you file CBCR in India, it's like exchanged to all the countries, or else, or you file in another country that is exchanged within India. And CBCR is essentially applicable only if you cross a global revenue of 5,500 crores, which is in line with BEPS action plans recommended turnover. It was in euro, we have converted into our Indian rupees. And it has to be filed within 12 months from the end of the accounting year. And reporting accounting year is defined. Technically, would mean that either the year which is followed by the parent company, or the year followed by Indian company, depending upon the circumstances that has been given in that rule. Now, our Indian, uh, you know, back of the mind, we think that what if we don't do any of this? What are the consequences? Prosecution is not covered obviously here, but penalty risk is very significant. So Section 270A, which is a draconian one, because it was introduced very recently and it has replaced 271(1)(c), and it has been formulated by way of mathematical formula, which says that if you fail to report any international transaction, it will be considered as misreporting, underreporting by way of misreporting, and you will have to pay 200% of the tax as a penalty. 271AA talks about failure to keep deed and documentation under section 92D. We have not covered 92D. I'll give you a brief about 92D. 92D also gives a reference to Rule 10D, where there is a list of information that you have to keep, and for X number of years, for you to satisfy the transfer pricing regulations. And it essentially includes all the prices that you have charged, all the information that you have, and many parts of the report has been imported from that only, and industry analysis report, the organization chart, the shareholding pattern, etc. So if you don't maintain this, then 2% of the value of the transaction could be levied as a penalty. What if you don't give master file? Then you are liable for a penalty of 5 lakh rupees. So really, I have seen people debating whether 5 lakh cost should be incurred, and obviously to be tested for prosecution, or should you go for master file and declare all your information and documents to the authorities. 271BA talks about failure to furnish report, that is chartered accountant's report. If you don't furnish it, then you have to pay penalty of INR 1 lakh, which is less as compared to what we have seen for 44AB. 271G is that even you have maintained deeds and documents and you have not furnished to EOTPO when they have asked for it, then similar penalty could also be extended 2%. And could we assume that it's like it has been assumed that you have not maintained that, and you will have to pay penalty for that purpose. 271GB specifically deals with CBCR related misreporting, or the CBCR related failures that you might have done. So if you completely fail to report CBCR, then rupees 5,000 per day penalty is applicable, till the time 30 days is not exhausted. Once 30 days is exhausted, penalty would be increased for 15,000 per day for every day beyond 1 month till the time you file the report. Second is, if you fail to furnish the information or documents that has been asked to you by way of 286.6. So 286.6 provides for power to the assessing officer to ask for information. If you fail to furnish those information, then 5,000 per day is the penalty. Now, if you once you have been served a notice, and after notice you will be served an order, and after passing the order, even if after passing the order you fail to furnish all any of the information or furnish the report, then a penalty would be post this rupees 50,000 per day, for which failure continues. So essentially they are saying just file it, will keep on increasing the penalty amount. And there is one interesting provision, which is that if you have found an inaccurate particulars, and if you don't furnish it, furnish the inaccurate particular within next number of days to us, then or we have identified some inaccurate particulars that you have furnished in CBCR, then you would be charged a gross penalty of rupees 5 lakh. So as compared to others, CBCR has some serious provisions. So it is recommended that instead of going into nitty-gritties of, sometimes people are saying that my turnover is not 5,500 crores, it could be 5,550. If I convert that at this conversion ratio, it is recommended that you satisfy and you file all the reports on time, so that you can save your client from the penalty. And obviously then you can technically argue on some matters, and all of this is obviously with an umbrella that wherever CIT or there is a power given for immunity from penalty, you can apply for those as well, and you can get out yourself from penalties. Now, coming to the last parts of the presentation, way forward is, there has been a debate as to whether transfer pricing is dying now. I mean, whether should you really look for transfer pricing, you know, ignoring the fact that BPS still has given importance to transfer pricing, and they've come out with three reports for that. Whether transfer pricing is really dying, my answer is no. I don't think it's dying, and I don't think it could be replaced. One of the most heated discussion is that whether it could be replaced by way of a global formulary approach prescribed by Rule 10, which says that assessing officer would determine profits as a percentage of turnover, or maybe assets, or maybe employees or something, and there are rulings as well which upholds Rule 10, and profits have been determined in accordance with Rule 10. So it would be really interesting to see whether there could be a mixture of transfer pricing as well as Rule 10, and Rule 10 could be made applicable in some of the transactions, and in some of the transactions transfer pricing strictly could be implemented. So far as we stand today, transfer pricing still holds good. There are so many things that we need to learn about, let's say APA, safe harbor, litigations, DRP, secondary adjustments, and MAP, multilateral APAs, etc., bilateral and multilateral APAs. So there are so many things, and I don't think in near future transfer pricing is dying, but it could be, as we see in global forums, it could be possible that it is replaced by, a global formulary approach, only if, all the SSAs start paying taxes in utmost honesty. So we can start taking questions.
Yeah, any questions, anyone?
Hello, this is I'm asking about that external and internal are used in all methods. What is that external concept?
Yeah, sure. So if internal is really where you one of the parties which is being tested for arm's length principle has a similar transaction with another known E. In such case, it would be considered as internal, and where there are different set of comparable parties that has transacted for the same transaction, then it would be considered as external. In an example, I'll give in our classic example where hand sanitizers are transferred from India after manufacturing to UAE. If UAE is sourcing the same from another Indian entity, then it's an internal. As compared to that, if UAE entity, there is UAE entity 2 and Indian entity 2, and both of them are transacting, and you know through some research report or some other methods that this is the price which is at which they are transacting, then you can that would be considered external cup, though although finding an external cup is difficult.
Any other questions? We have one question in the chat box. Is there any standard websites where the comparable rates are found by the department? Please give examples.
Yeah, sure. So there are databases where generally these methods, after determining most appropriate method, there are databases where you can search for the similar transactions, and depending upon which is the tested party, India has Capitaline, then we have Provis, we have ASTP. Uh, some of the departments offices use ASTP. Somewhere I've also seen Provis being used. Somewhere I've also seen um, Capitaline being used, and certain type of specific transactions are also compiled by other agencies like Thomson Reuters has 2 or 3 softwares for interest rates. They have according to the ratings that the borrower might be having. So it is different, and essentially once you move from one database to another in the database, results could be different, and that is why some I've seen in many litigations because of difference in the database, they have the matter has reached up to DRP or ITEC level. I
Yeah.
have one question on my chat box which is uh, how to Mr. Mehul Kadi, how to identify such transaction which routed by a third party. So that is if you see, penalty provisions have been incorporated in such a manner that it could become your responsibility to report those transactions, because Form 3CED is specifically giving a separate reporting for deemed international transaction. So first of all, you will have to identify whether you have a deemed international transaction. Second is that if you don't have a deemed international transaction, the assessing officer would obviously TPO are smart enough today to look over the similar type of transaction that you have entered with another known A, and then they try to catch all those transactions. Obviously, there they need a certain corroborating evidence from that third party as well by issuing notices less under 133 or maybe other sections. But obviously, it will be difficult to find out those transactions. But first onus is on you to report those transactions.
Yeah, I think I have also answered that question in the chat box, that you need to look at the transaction as a whole. You also look at the arrangement, the documentation, the agreements, etc. So that is important to conclude on whether it is an international transaction or not.
Correct.
Rajiv Bhai has a question where Dubai is made hub for storage and then forward export. How can such transactions be covered under TP? So Rajiv, here what is important to understand is what are the functions, assets, and risk being employed by the Dubai entity, and accordingly you need to compensate the Dubai entity in terms of the remuneration. Is it just for the rental charges or carrying, clearing, and forwarding charges, etc.? So therefore it depends on the transaction, or what are the, I would say, the functions carried on by the Dubai entity, what is the risk undertaken by the Dubai entity, and whether it holds any asset, for example warehouse, or any equipment for the movement of goods, etc. All these will determine, and again taken together with the overall business, this together will determine how do you arrive at the transfer price.
Yeah.
Bhushan Patil having AE in US, does it require to file master file by the Indian entity? Parag, you want to take it up?
Yeah, sorry, I missed that.
Yeah, having an AE in USA, does it require to file master file by Indian entity?
Yes, so part A is made applicable to everyone. Part B, part A is really just PAN amount, AY, etc. Part B is the exhaustive parts, where part B would be applicable only if you cross those thresholds. Thresholds are 500 crores of turnover, global turnover, and international transaction more than 50 crores, or IP transfer more than 10 crores. So once you cross that, obviously part B needs to be filed by the Indian entity in India.
Yeah. I think that's all on the questions. Kaushik, over to you.
Yeah, am I audible?
Yes, you are.
Yeah, sir.
Yeah, okay. So Parag, thank you once again for taking out your time and and enlightening all the members on this very beautiful topic of transfer pricing. And also congratulations on your rank holder. And I also want to thank all the members for taking out time and attending this session. And very well supported by Vyomesh for for having this series for all the members, and bringing out the best speakers and the young talent from various regions and from various firms to this platform, and giving them an opportunity to present them, and giving them this platform so that they can reach out to members and enlighten their knowledge. So thank you once again. Thanks, and have a great time. Thank you, everyone.
So
Thank you, sir.
as we announced tomorrow, just one announcement, Kaushik. Tomorrow we have
Yeah.
an important session on TDS on non-residents. Based on various requests received, we have arranged this session from 4 to 6 tomorrow, which will cover the practical aspects of 15 CACB also. So this is an important session tomorrow, and again it has been on public demand. So we look forward to more participation tomorrow also.
Yeah, this
And
was
then
a repeat one, I suppose.
no, not the repeat one. This is
Acha.
for Form 15 CACB and TDS on non-residents.
Okay, okay, I got that. Fine.
Yeah.
Thank
And
you.
on Saturday
Thanks,
we again
Parag.
meet
Yeah.
Santosh Jagdale. Saturday we again meet on Santosh Jagdale, same with Santosh Jagdale on MLI.
Okay, great.
Yep. Thank you.
Yeah.
And
Thanks,
Parag.
everyone.
Thank you.
Thanks,
Thank you,
everyone.
sir.
Thanks, Parag. Thanks. Bye.
Thank you, Ramesh sir,
Yeah.
for chipping in wherever required, and thank you all the participants.
Yep. Thank you.
Thanks.
Bye.
Good night.
Thanks.